The Flame Queen, Part 2. Chapter 14, The Bloodstone Stirs. The glow began deep beneath the surface of Nocturne, far below the catacombs and the forgotten burial grounds, in a chamber carved by hands that no longer had names, a place that was never mapped, never spoken of, not even by those who ruled from thrones of bone and velvet. The bloodstone pulsed in its prison of obsidian and iron, a monolithic shard of ancient magic, forged from the first war, sealed by the oldest pact. And now it breathed again, slow at first, like lungs filling after centuries submerged, then faster, deeper, until the walls around it began to hum, veins of light cracking through the darkness, reaching outward like roots, like claws. Above ground, Eva felt it like a strike to the chest, her body jolting as the energy surged through her, knocking the air from her lungs and the silence from the cathedral. Her knees buckled, but she didn't fall, didn't cry out. She clutched the crown in her hands and held it close as if it could anchor her to the moment, to her identity, to the fragile balance between the woman she had been and the queen she was becoming. Dorian caught her by the shoulders, steadying her, his eyes wide. "It's begun," he whispered, and she nodded, tears streaking her cheeks, not from fear but from recognition. "The bloodstone," she said, her voice hoarse, "it's calling, not just to her, but to everything that remembered, to everything that had been bound by the covenant, to those who had once bent the knee to her or bled in her name or cursed her memory in the silence of exile. They all heard it now, a low, thrumming call in their veins, a sound that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. In the far reaches of Nocturne, the old blood stirred, fey exiles with silver eyes snapped awake from trance-like slumber, witches whose lineage had gone dark suddenly burned with spellfire beneath their skin. Revenants chained beneath sanctified crypts howled and tore at the earth, the call rippling out in waves, unnoticed by mortals but impossible to ignore by those who bore the mark. And within the vampire court, chaos bloomed in silence. Nyxeria stood before the stone map that spanned the chamber floor, an ancient construct of magic and memory, veins of red light now glowing across it like open wounds, each pulse marking a place of awakening, a location where magic was blooming wild and uncontained. "They're responding," whispered Lord Vire, eyes wide. "We cannot contain this, we were never meant to," Nyxeria replied, her tone unreadable, her expression a mask of poise stretched thin over something volatile. "The fire always returns." She turned to the gathered council, her voice sharp and final. "Summon the reapers, bind the gatewatch, alert the seers." A murmur of protest rose, but she silenced it with a glance. "The old world is crumbling," she said, "and we will either kneel before what rises or be consumed by it." In the cathedral, Eva stepped away from Dorian and walked to the altar, the crown now pulsing in her grip with heat and light, and she set it down upon the stone, staring into the heart of it. And in that moment she saw her reflection, not the woman from the bar, not the dreamer in the mirror, but the truth, her skin glowing faintly, her eyes burning with gold flame, her aura flickering between past and present like a candle caught between gusts. "This is what they feared," she said aloud, "not the bloodline, not the power, but the return of memory." Dorian approached, slower this time, his voice cautious. "What does it want from you?" "It doesn't want," she said, "it remembers." And she reached out, touching the crown with her fingertips, and the room erupted in light, blinding and raw. The stained glass above shattered, casting shards of color in every direction, and when the light faded she stood taller, the weight of centuries threading through her spine, the voice of the bloodstone humming behind her ribs. And she turned to him, not as Eva, not fully as Aurelienne, but as something new, something whole. "We go to the court," she said. "Tonight, you won't be welcomed," he said, his voice low. "No," she agreed, "but I will be seen." And outside, the moon turned red, full and heavy, as if watching the city from behind a veil of smoke. And across rooftops and shadows, eyes watched, ears listened, hearts remembered, and the world held its breath for the queen who had returned, and not to reclaim her throne, but to burn it down and build something far older in its ashes. Chapter 15, March of the Forgotten. The streets of Nocturne were not made for ceremony but for secrets, winding alleys and crooked bridges slick with old rain and older blood, but tonight they bore witness to something ancient returning, something not seen in centuries yet etched into the marrow of the city. Eva walked with the crown in her hands, not upon her head yet, not until the moment was right, not until it was earned, not as a symbol of power but of memory, of fire reborn. Dorian walked at her side in silence, cloaked in shadow, his presence a sentinel against the growing whispers. The city noticed her now, not with curiosity but with recognition. The stones beneath her feet remembered her weight, the glyphs carved into doorways flickered faintly as she passed, once dormant enchantments awakening as if to bow in silence. High above, creatures with silver eyes watched from crumbling towers. Witches drew circles in soot and salt and whispered her name beneath their breath, not in fear but in longing. As though waiting all their lives for this moment to rise again from myth, Eva did not speak as they made their way toward the court, but her mind burned with visions not her own, battles in forgotten fields, betrayals written in sacred blood, a throne room shattered by spellfire and tears, the sound of her own voice screaming in grief as everything crumbled, and through it all, the song of the bloodstone beneath the city, louder now, insistent, a steady drumbeat in her veins calling her forward. Calling her home. When they reached the gates of the court, carved from obsidian and iron, shaped like ribs holding back a heart, they stood closed, sealed by centuries of law and fear. Dorian stepped forward, drawing a breath to speak, to demand entry, but Eva raised a hand to stop him, her eyes locked on the ancient sigils that glowed faintly beneath the gate's arch, and she reached into herself, past the fear, past the echo of who she had been, until she found the thread of fire that had always been there. The root of her true name, and she spoke it, not aloud, but within, a word that trembled across realms, a name that cracked the air and made the gates shudder. Aurelienne. The gates did not swing open, they sighed, the iron groaning like an old beast disturbed from slumber, and then they parted, revealing the grand hall beyond, torchlit and silent, lined with shadows dressed in velvet and bone, vampires of the old blood, the high houses, the guardians of the covenant. And at the end of the hall stood Nyxeria, poised and perfect, her hands clasped before her, her eyes glowing with something unreadable, not hatred, not fear, anticipation. As Eva stepped inside, every eye turned to her, and not one dared speak. Not yet. Dorian flanked her, his posture guarded, but she did not falter. Each step echoed through the chamber like a drumbeat, like a sentence being written. When she reached the circle of thrones, she stopped, holding the crown before her like an offering, like a challenge, and looked straight into the eyes of the countess. You summoned the bloodstone when you buried me, she said, her voice cutting through the silence. You broke the world and called it order. Nyxeria's lips curled into a smile, slow and sharp. And you shattered the covenant with your love, she replied. You burned down the old ways and called it freedom. Eva stepped closer, her fire flaring now, heat rippling off her skin. I did what was necessary, she said, and I would do it again. Nyxeria descended the steps of her throne, their power radiating like twin storms colliding. Then show us, the countess whispered, show us who you truly are. And Eva raised the crown, placed it upon her brow, and the world changed. The torches flared white, the sigils on the walls blazed gold, the floor cracked beneath her feet as magic surged outward, ancient and furious and free. And every vampire in the hall dropped to their knees, not by choice but by command, their bodies bowing to a power older than their laws, older than their fear. Nyxeria remained standing, watching, her smile now gone, replaced by something deeper, respect, perhaps, or the quiet acceptance of fate fulfilled. Welcome back, Aurelienne, she said, and Eva, her eyes glowing with the light of a star long buried, replied, this time, I'm not here to rule, I'm here to finish what we started. And the court, for the first time in an age, listened. Chapter 16, 13 Shadows and the Ash Throne. The court of 13 had not been full in centuries, its thrones carved from obsidian and memory, each one shaped for the bloodlines that once ruled unchallenged. And now, as Eva stood beneath the high arches of the chamber with the crown still pulsing against her brow, the air shimmered with the weight of unspoken truths and ancestral silence. The stone beneath her feet was cracked and blackened, its lines still echoing from the shock of her awakening. And around her, the vampire lords remained kneeling, heads bowed not in reverence but in submission to a truth they could no longer deny. The fire had returned, the name buried beneath time had been unearthed, and the queen who had once unmade thrones with her voice alone had stepped through the veil of forgetting and claimed her name. Dorian stood just behind her, silent as ever, his presence a constant in the chaos, his eyes scanning the council, his hand hovering near the blade hidden in his coat. But it was not Dorian they feared, not tonight, it was her, not Eva the singer, not even Aurelienne the heir, but the fusion of both, the soul with teeth, the memory with a heartbeat, the fire with a voice. Nyxeria stood before her, the only one unbowed, her crimson and black robes catching the flickering torchlight like rivers of blood woven with shadow, and she studied Eva with the gaze of someone who had once ruled beside gods and slain angels, her face unreadable, poised, and impossibly still. The court must be whole before it decides, Nyxeria said at last, her voice smooth as velvet stretched over stone. 13 thrones, 13 votes, 13 truths. Eva looked around, her eyes landing on the 4 empty thrones still draped in chains and cobwebs, relics of bloodlines lost, silenced, erased. Then unchain them, she said, her voice steady, call them back. The council stirred uneasily, whispers rising like ash from old fire. Their blood is gone, Lord Mayron rasped. His fingers curled around the arm of his throne, their lines broken, their banners torn, their memory remains, Eva said sharply, and memory answers when summoned. Nyxeria raised one slender hand, and the torches dimmed, the hall shifting, growing colder as ancient magic thickened in the air, and from the shadows beyond the circle of thrones came motion, slow, deliberate, and terrible. The forgotten stepped into the light, not quite living, not quite dead, remnants of what once was, clothed in the remnants of dignity and doom, the descendants of the erased, those who had survived in exile and silence, their eyes hollowed by time but still burning with purpose. One by one they approached the empty thrones, placing their hands upon them, and as they did the chains snapped, not with sound but with light, each link evaporating in a hiss of silver smoke, and the thrones accepted them, changed for them, reshaped themselves to fit new rulers. Blood reborn, and when the circle was whole, when all 13 stood complete, Nyxeria turned to Eva again. You come bearing fire and name, she said, but the covenant is not undone with memory alone. Eva stepped forward, raising her voice so it filled the chamber, weaving through every vaulted crevice. I come bearing the fire we all swore to extinguish, but failed to destroy, she said. I come with the name you buried because it frightened you more than the wars you created. Her eyes swept over the circle, landing on each face in turn. I am not here to return to the old ways, I am here to end them. The room trembled, the torches flared, and somewhere deep beneath the court, the bloodstone pulsed, responding to her words, ancient magic reawakening to her call. You want a vote? She continued, stepping into the center of the ring, her voice ringing with the weight of destiny. Then vote. But know this, you are not choosing whether I return. You are choosing whether you stand beside me as the covenant breaks, or are swept beneath it when it falls. Silence reigned, heavy, sacred, and then Nyxeria, after a pause that stretched like a blade held at the throat, smiled, not cruelly, but like someone watching a storm they had long known was coming finally arrive, and she raised her hand, fingers spread, palm toward the center. I vote I, she said, and her voice made the shadows flinch. One by one the others followed, some hesitant, some resigned, a few furious but unable to defy what their blood already knew. And when the 13th hand rose, the court itself reacted, the floor cracking, light pouring from the fractures, the ceiling trembling, and the old glyphs burning gold once more. Eva stepped back, lifting the crown from her head and placing it on the center altar, now molten and glowing, the moment sealed in power, and with it, the covenant fractured, not shattered, not yet, but the first crack had formed, deep and irreversible, and across the city, across the realm, those bound by it felt the tremor in their soul, and knew the world was changing. Not tomorrow, not in time, but now. Chapter 17, The Unmaking begins. The chamber groaned as if the stone itself felt betrayal, as if the foundations of the covenant had been laid not in magic but in trust, and now that trust, ancient, cracked, and brittle, had been broken by the simple act of remembrance, of defiance given voice by the one who should have remained forgotten. The glow from the altar intensified, a pool of molten light spreading out like liquid memory across the floor, and in its center sat the crown, no longer just a symbol but a living artifact, a Vessel of power that pulsed in time with Eva's breath, and though she had set it down, it was still hers, bound now not just to her lineage but to her will, to the fire that had returned not as prophecy but as inevitability. The 13 stood silent, each throne flickering with light or shadow depending on the heart of the one who sat upon it. Some bowed their heads in quiet acceptance, others stared ahead, faces cold, unreadable, masking the panic that twisted beneath their immortal skin. And Nyxaria, the countess who had once orchestrated the great silencing of the Flameborn, stood with her hands clasped and her expression carved from marble, not victorious, not defeated, but watchful, always watchful. Eva turned to face the circle, her voice quiet now but sharp enough to cut glass. "It has begun," she said. "You all feel it, the change, the unraveling." And they did, in their blood, in the marrow of their ancient bones. They felt the covenant begin to fray at the seams, the oaths that once chained them growing slack and uncertain, the magic that had bound the lines of power and succession now flickering like a dying star. "We have kept this world in stasis," she continued, "feeding it on fear, on sacrifice, on silence, and it has rotted beneath our feet." She stepped into the golden light without flinching, without hesitation, and it rose to meet her, curling around her boots, licking at her coat like fire too ancient to burn. "I remember what came before," she said. "I remember the world we lost, the songs we buried, the names we erased to protect our illusion of order." Her gaze landed on Nyxaria, and though the countess did not look away, something in her posture stiffened, like the memory had teeth, like the truth had finally grown fangs. "You were there," Eva said, "at the gates, when we begged for peace, when we bled for mercy, and you closed the door and called it strength." Nyxaria's voice, when it came, was soft but full of weight. "I did what was necessary," she said. "You would have torn everything down, and now I will." Eva replied, not with anger, but with certainty. The light at her feet flared, casting long shadows across the chamber, and a rumble echoed from deep below, beneath the floor, beneath the city, where the bloodstone had cracked open and begun to awaken fully, and through that crack surged power, raw, unchecked, ancient as the stars. And with it came voices, not in language but in intent. Memory made noise, the resonance of those who had once knelt before her throne, those who had died when it was taken, those who had waited in silence for her return. The ground split in a ring around the altar, the molten light bursting upward like a corona of flame, and the walls of the chamber flickered, rippling to reveal visions, brief, terrible flashes of what was coming, cities aflame beneath black skies, towers falling as screams tore through the night, wings of ash and bone rising over battlefields soaked in magic and blood. And standing in the center of it all, her silhouette crowned in fire, her hands glowing with spell light and vengeance, was Eva, no longer a memory, no longer hidden. The 13 saw it, all of them, and whether they welcomed it or not, they understood. The old order was dead, the unmaking had begun, and there would be no return, only transformation or ruin. "The covenant is broken," Eva said, and the magic snapped like a chain torn from flesh. The echo of it rattling through the court, through the city, through the ley lines that stitched the realm together, and in its wake, power surged into the cracks left behind, wild, hungry, and waiting to be claimed. The chamber trembled again, and this time it wasn't from magic, it was from footfalls, hundreds of them, echoing from the halls beyond, as those who had once served, once fled, once resisted, arrived, drawn by the change, by the return of the name they had never truly forgotten. Creatures cloaked in shadow, humans with fire in their veins, fey exiles bearing blades made of bone and sorrow, they filled the court's outer halls, not in rage but in readiness, and when Eva turned to them, they fell silent, eyes locked on her, breath held, and she raised one hand, not in command, not in warning, but in invitation. "We are not here to destroy," she said, her voice rising, ringing out like a bell over a grave. "We are here to choose." And in that moment, the court was no longer a seat of power but a battlefield of belief, and the first war of the new age began not with blood, but with memory reclaimed and fire reborn. Chapter 18, The Queen's Ultimatum. The Court of 13 had never felt so alive, not in centuries, not since the first binding when oaths were etched in blood and sealed in shadow, but now the chamber pulsed with something far older, far more dangerous than ancient allegiance. It pulsed with choice, with free will ripped from the grave of forgotten destiny and laid bare before those who once ruled like gods in velvet and bone, Eva stood in the center of the cracked altar ring, the molten light beneath her feet slowly dimming to a steady pulse like a second heart, a rhythm shared now by every soul awakened by the breach in the covenant. She could feel them, across Nocturne, across the realm, the hearts that beat differently now, the magic that no longer obeyed the old laws, the power shifting, searching for new vessels, new voices. The council sat rigid in their thrones, expressions ranging from shock to seething fury. Nyxeria remained standing, her eyes narrowed but not in anger, in calculation. The Countess was not a creature easily shaken, but even she could feel the air thinning around them, the very weight of the chamber pulling in like a breath held too long. You have undone what was never meant to be touched, Lord Vire hissed, rising from his throne with trembling fingers curled like talons. The covenant kept us safe, kept the chaos from swallowing us whole. The covenant kept you fed, Eva countered, her voice echoing through the vaulted chamber, fed on silence, on sacrifice, on the suffering of those you labeled dangerous because you could not control them. Murmurs rose behind her, not just from the lords and ladies of the court but from the gathering crowd beyond the chamber doors, those who had come when the thrones lit gold and the bloodstone called out across the ley lines, the forgotten, the exiled, the magic-born, the half-bloods, the creatures of twilight and broken lineage, the ones who had no place in the court's carefully curated bloodlines. Dorian stood to her right, his hand resting on the hilt of a blade forged in the days before the world was divided by covenant and fear, his gaze sweeping the room like a storm gathering in silence, ready, always ready. But Eva didn't need his blade, not yet, not for this. She turned slowly, meeting the eyes of each of the 13, including those newly seated, their thrones still humming from blood recognition. You say I broke the covenant, she said, her voice like velvet soaked in flame, but it was already broken. The moment it was written with the blood of those who were never given a voice. She stepped forward, one deliberate pace that sent a ripple through the magic in the floor, the sigils flashing beneath her feet, reacting to her presence, to her truth. I offer you a choice, she said, stand with me, and we unmake this world not in fire, but in rebirth. We build a realm where magic is not caged, where blood is not currency, where thrones are earned, not inherited. Another step, another flare of light, or, she continued. And now her voice dropped, sharpened, thunderous in its quiet, cling to your dying laws and be buried with them. Silence answered her, vast and terrible, until the chamber doors groaned open and a figure stepped through, a girl no older than Eva had been when she first sang in the crimson glass, eyes wide with raw power, her hands glowing faintly with light, untrained, unrefined, untamed. Behind her came others, young, old, broken, burning, all bearing the signs of awakened blood, all drawn to this moment. And Eva turned to the council, lifting her hand. This is the new court, she said, not thrones, not chains, voices, fire, and choice. And the light exploded, not in destruction, but in revelation, filling the chamber, washing over everything, and in its wake, shadows peeled away from the corners of the court like old skin, revealing the truth etched in every wall, every floorboard, every breath. They had ruled through fear because they had forgotten what it meant to lead through purpose. And as the fire settled, as the crowd bowed not to a queen but to a kindling of revolution, Countess Nyxeria finally moved, stepping forward, lowering her hood, revealing not rage but something closer to awe, and she spoke with the voice of one who had seen time unravel and reform and still chosen to remain. Then lead them, she said, but know this, when you tear down the old, you inherit its ghosts. And Eva nodded once, eyes burning, voice steady. Then let them haunt me, I will not flinch. And with those words, the court shifted, not in allegiance, but in gravity, as if the realm itself had tilted, its axis broken and reformed around a name once erased, now unforgotten. Aurelienne, Queen of Flame, returned not to wear a crown, but to give it to the world. Chapter 19, The Crownless Throne. The chamber that had once been a monument to power sealed in blood and shadow now breathed like a living thing. The old thrones still stood in their circle of control, but their presence felt faded, relics of an empire that had begun to crumble the moment Eva stepped through the veil and remembered who she truly was. the light from the altar had dimmed into a quiet glow, no longer molten but warm, like coals beneath ash. And the air itself shimmered faintly with the residue of ancient magic that had been awakened. The 13 watched in stunned silence as Eva turned her back on the thrones, not in disrespect but in declaration, and walked toward the crowd gathering in the marble corridors beyond. The doorway had become a floodgate, more arriving by the second, witches with starlight in their veins, fey exiles who bore antlers carved by frost, shifters whose eyes flickered with wildfire, revenants with skin marked by old runes and centuries of silence, and humans. 2. Those who had been touched by magic and left unclaimed, their bloodlines deemed unworthy by the court's cruel lineage laws, and now all of them stared at her, not with blind devotion but with hunger, for change, for voice, for something real. Dorian remained behind, his gaze on the crown still sitting on the altar like a challenge, and beside it stood Nyxeria, still, composed, but the storm within her eyes undeniable. Eva turned to them both and then to the crowd, her voice steady though she felt the fire of the bloodstone still thrumming through every vein. "This is no longer a place for kings and queens," she said, the words rolling through the air like a spell woven from memory and revolt. "This is not a seat to be claimed, but a space to be shared." Her gaze swept the crowd, her arms lifting slightly, welcoming rather than commanding. "I will not wear the crown until the world is ready for one that does not rule but listens." Murmurs rippled like wind across water, disbelief, wonder, but also understanding. In the center of the altar, the crown shimmered and then crumbled into ash, not with loss, but with transformation, and the ash rose into the air, drifting above them, forming a circle that spun slowly in place, an emblem, a symbol of what had come before and what would come next, a throne that no one sat on, but all stood beneath. The light from the broken sigils along the walls shifted from gold to white, the final sign that the power had changed hands, not seized, not stolen, but returned, earned, shared. Eva stepped down from the dais and into the crowd, and they parted for her, not out of fear but reverence. Dorian moved to follow but paused as Nyxeria approached him, her voice low and quiet, meant only for him. "She is not what I expected," she said, and Dorian smiled without humor. "She never is." Nyxeria watched Eva disappear into the mass of people now surging toward the outer halls of the court, and her lips curled into something that might have been satisfaction, or perhaps resignation. "The world will resist her," she said, "it will break her if it can," and Dorian nodded, watching the glowing ash ring float where the crown once sat. "Then let it try." Outside, the sky above Nocturne had begun to shift, clouds curling into unnatural spirals, the stars blinking brighter than they had in 1,000 years. The city groaned as its ley lines twisted and reformed beneath stone and steel, and the magic that once obeyed the old laws now danced freely, uncontrolled, reborn. In hidden places across the realm, those who had once bowed now stood, those who had once been hunted now howled in the open, and in the deep silence that followed Eva's declaration, something else awakened, not of blood or magic, but of prophecy, a thing long buried beneath denial and fear, a force that had once been bound by the covenant now stirred, blind and ravenous, the first crack echoing through the abyss as it opened an ancient eye, and whispered the true cost of freedom in a tongue no living thing had heard since the world bled its first star into the sky. The crownless throne had been claimed, not by a sovereign, but by a spark, and now the fire would either forge a new world, or consume everything in its path. Chapter 20, Whispers in the Hollow. The skies over Nocturne darkened in slow spirals as the city exhaled magic it had forgotten how to contain, power once shackled by blood oaths now leaking into the streets, into alleyways and gutters and cracked cathedral steps where wild things stirred from sleep. Eva stood at the center of the storm's calm, her hands still tingling with the echo of the bloodstone's resonance. The crowd around her had not dispersed but grown, words spreading like fire on dry parchment, and with it came those drawn not to royalty, but to truth. The Hollow, a name whispered only in old songs and warnings, had begun to respond. It had felt the covenant break, had heard the Queen of Flame refuse the throne, and it stirred not in hunger or rage but in recognition, in something far worse, anticipation. Far beneath the city, where the ground no longer obeyed natural laws, where roots had turned to bone and rivers ran with memory instead of water, the hollow pulsed, unseen, untouched, waiting. It was not a place, not fully, but a consciousness, a wound in the world that had never truly healed, created in the First War when magic rebelled against order and chose chaos. It had been sealed beneath layers of blood and stone, its name erased from every book except those written in pain, and now it opened its eye, singular and infinite, and looked toward Eva, not to destroy her but to test her, to challenge the fire that dared unseat shadow. Eva felt it like a pressure in her spine, a whisper curled just beneath the hum of the bloodstone, a wordless question waiting in the dark, not a threat, but a summons. She walked through nocturne streets as if sleepwalking, drawn toward it, toward the fault line opening beneath the cathedral ruins where she had first remembered her name. Dorian followed, saying nothing, his eyes on her back, his hand resting on the hilt of a blade that hadn't seen light since the fall of the first throne. The city gave way as they walked, buildings bowing in strange angles, light posts flickering with pulses of ancient power, the sky split with veins of gold and violet where stars blinked like eyes, and at the steps of the cathedral, she stopped, her breath catching as the earth beneath her rippled like liquid stone. The altar had cracked wide, the ring of ash where the crown once burned now a circle of open flame, and beyond it, a chasm, wide and black and whispering, the hollow, open at last, not a door, not a pit, but a mouth, and from it rose voices, layered and low, speaking not in words but in memories, hers, and not hers, all tangled, all real. The sound wrapped around her skull, pulling her forward, testing her resolve. This is it, she said softly, not to Dorian, not even to herself, but to the voice inside her that had never truly left, the voice of Aurelienne, Queen of Flame, Child of Storm. This is where it ends. Dorian stepped to her side, his face pale but steady. Or begins, he said, and she turned her head just slightly, her eyes glowing like the horizon before wildfire. I'm not afraid of the end, she said, I'm afraid of leaving it unfinished. And then she stepped into the hollow, the flame circle vanishing behind her like breath into snow, the light swallowed, her body fading into shadow, not destroyed but remade, one layer at a time. The hollow accepted her not as enemy or sacrifice, but as question, and it asked her, what is power if not remembered? What is legacy if not burned clean? What is a queen who wears no crown but holds the hearts of 1,000 broken things? And she answered with silence, with strength, with every step forward, and the hollow responded, not with collapse, but with revelation. The walls around her pulsed with imagery, her past lives, her failures, the betrayal that broke her court, the blood that drowned her throne, the child she had once been singing in a candlelit alley, the girl who walked into a vampire's gaze and never walked out the same, all of it here, laid bare. And she did not flinch, did not deny, she accepted, all of it, and in doing so, something deep within the hollow cracked, not broken, not bleeding, but unlocked, and from that split rose light, impossibly pure, impossibly old, and it entered her, not violently but wholly, stitching the pieces she had never known were torn, fire and memory and soul. And when she emerged from the hollow, hours or centuries later, no one could say for sure, she stood not as Eva, not just as Aurelienne, but as something new, the flame that remembered, the girl who chose truth over throne. And as the light broke over the horizon, bleeding through clouds like the beginning of a second dawn, the city knelt, not in loyalty, but in awe, and the world exhaled, waiting for her first word. Chapter 21, The Fire That Speaks. When Eva emerged from the hollow, the city did not roar, it fell silent, a silence more complete than death, more sacred than ritual, as if the world itself had bowed its head to witness something it did not yet understand. Her body carried no mark of fire, no visible crown or ceremonial armor, but her presence had changed, sharpened, expanded, like her skin now contained a storm rather than a soul. Her eyes glowed with threads of gold and ember red, their depths reflecting not light but memory. Living memory, the kind that reshapes not just thought, but reality. Her breath steamed in the air though it was not cold, each exhale a whisper of spellcraft so old it hummed beneath the bones of the earth. Dorian stepped forward first, his posture still, but his gaze unblinking, and when he spoke it was with a voice softened by awe. What did it show you? And she turned to him slowly, her head tilting as if adjusting to time itself. Her voice low and clear like steel drawn across silk. It didn't show me, it listened. The gathered crowd before the cathedral knelt, not commanded, not even asked, but moved by something deeper, instinctual, the recognition of something greater than authority, something forged in truth. Her steps echoed on stone that remembered her name, stone that once cradled her death and now welcomed her return. And with every footfall the ley lines beneath Nocturne responded, glowing faintly as if awakening from long slumber. The city's breath quickened, its walls groaning like an old leviathan turning in its sleep, and in the highest towers, in sanctums sealed since the time before time, wards cracked and dissolved, unable to resist the new pulse of magic rising through the foundation of the world. Eva stopped at the base of the old altar steps, now overgrown with moss and lined with glyphs revealed only under her shadow. She looked upon those who had followed her here, witches with eyes like starfire, vampires still trembling from the shift in blood bond, fae once banished now standing with heads high, humans touched by flame now burning brighter. And she raised her hand, palm open, not raised in command but offered in unity. The hollow still hummed behind her, not in hunger, but in harmony, a wound closed not by sealing, but by understanding. The world we knew is gone, she said, and her voice carried through the wind like prophecy. It ended not in battle, not in ash, but in choice. Murmurs stilled, breaths held, hearts beating in unison with the flame beneath her skin. You were told to fear what you are, she continued, taught to hide your power, to bury your names, to bleed in silence so that others could drink peace from your sacrifice. She stepped forward, her voice rising, each word forging a path through the centuries of oppression laid over them like stone. No more. A crack split the air, not from sky or earth, but from the veil itself. The thin membrane between realms that had long held secrets in silence, and from it poured echoes, spirits of those who had died before they could claim their truth, their magic, their names. They danced in the air above her, swirling like smoke and starlight, weeping, laughing, rejoicing, freed not by revenge, but by remembrance. Eva turned her gaze skyward, toward the crimson ring that now marked the sun's edge, the final sign that the old prophecy, the one that spoke of a queen with no throne, who would burn the world to remake it, had begun. You are the court now, she said, eyes sweeping over them all. Your voice is law, your pain is sacred, your blood is not a curse but a key. And from the edges of the crowd came a ripple, a figure cloaked in feathers and glass, a seer, her eyes milk-white and glowing. They will not let this stand, the seer said, her voice layered with 1,000 echoes. The outer thrones will rise, the forgotten kings, the crimson choir, they will come. Eva looked at her, not with fear but with clarity. Then let them, she said, we do not hide any more. And at her words the ash ring above the altar burst into flame again, but this time it did not consume, it crowned the sky, a fire circle unbroken, ever burning, the symbol not of dominion, but of awakening. And the world felt it, across oceans and through ruined spires, across the dead roots of cursed forests and the bleeding edges of broken realms. Everything heard the flames return, and in dark places where old kings whispered in stone, where the crimson choir sharpened their tongues and the hollow's twin opened its eye, the answer came, not in warning, but in recognition. The game had changed, the board burned clean, and now the fire would speak. Chapter 22, The Fireborn War. The air shifted the moment the flame crowned the sky, not just in Nocturne, but across every forgotten kingdom, every hidden hollow, every realm that had once bent beneath the weight of the Covenant's cruel design. The world trembled, not from fear, but from recognition, for the old prophecies had spoken of this moment in whispers and riddles, in dreams carried through bloodlines and etched into bones buried deep. They had foretold the day when a queen would return, and not to sit upon a throne but to set it ablaze. And now that day had come, not with the sound of war drums but with the crackle of truth spreading like wildfire. Eva stood before the gathered court of the reborn, the crownless queen cloaked in light and memory, the hollow pulsing quietly behind her, now sealed not by spells but by her choice, not locked away but woven into her soul, a balanced wound, a sacred scar. Dorian stood at her side, eyes scanning the horizon as if he could already see the enemies gathering beyond the mountains, beyond the sea, beyond the veil, because they would come, those who still fed on fear, who believed control was order and silence was peace, those who had watched from the shadows, waiting to strike the moment the fire burned too bright, and strike they would, not to reclaim the throne, but to bury it, to drown the world once more in shadow and lies. And so Eva prepared, not for coronation, but for war. She called the first conclave under the ash ring at dawn, and they came, magic-born and mortal, vampire and witch, fey and flame-touched, each bringing what they had been denied for so long. Their voices, the cathedral ruins, became the heart of the resistance, not a temple but a forge, and the queen did not rule from above but from within, walking among them, learning their stories, their pain, their fury. She spoke their names aloud until the stone remembered them, and in doing so, awakened powers long thought lost. The ley lines beneath Nocturne shifted, realigned, drawn to her will like iron to flame, and from them sprang new enchantments, not chains, but shields, spells crafted not to bind, but to protect. The city changed, subtly at first, lights burning longer, magic flaring brighter, the sky over Nocturne no longer stained with smoke but lit with auroras of violet and gold. Yet peace did not come, it never had a chance to, for the world beyond had felt the same tremor, and they did not see it as rebirth, they saw it as rebellion, and so the first strike came not from soldiers, but from song, a sound that split the sky in the north, carried by the crimson choir, ancient beings made not of flesh but of music and ruin, their voices twisted by centuries of servitude, used to enforce the laws of silence, now released from their oaths, but not their hunger. They came with wings of bone and faces veiled in gold, their song capable of cracking stone and splitting minds, and Eva met them not with swords, but with memory. She climbed the highest tower of the cathedral and sang, a single note carried from her soul through the heart flame, the song of the first unmaking, the lullaby she had sung in another life, in another war, when the world had tried to kill truth and bury love. Her voice wrapped around their song, not to silence it but to change its shape, and one by one the choir faltered, their notes distorting, breaking apart, not destroyed, but transformed, for even they had once been free, and now they remembered. She gave them that choice, and most vanished into mist, into peace, but not all. Some fled, carrying word of her power to darker places, and in those places the forgotten kings stirred, the ones who had never accepted the covenant, not because it was too cruel, but because it was not cruel enough, tyrants with tombs for palaces, who ruled in secret while the world mourned them as myths, and now they marched, armies of bone and shadow, pulled from barrows and black lakes. Eager to extinguish the fire before it spread, Eva knew she could not stop them all alone, and so she lit the signal pyres, towers of old magic scattered across the realm, long dormant, awaiting a queen with no throne and a name made of ash and flame. One by one they ignited, beams of golden-red fire piercing the sky, summoning allies who had not walked this realm in centuries, storm singers from the sky isles, wolf-bound mages from the winterwoods, dragons in human skin from the ruined peaks of Verith. The fire called them all, not to serve, but to stand. The war that followed was not clean or noble, it was raw, tangled in blood and memory, fought in dreamscapes and ruins, across rivers that ran with ghost light and mountains that screamed when touched. Eva fought not as a monarch, but as a symbol, not untouchable but unbreakable. The battle that defined it all came beneath a blood eclipse, where the last forgotten king met her in the veil's wound, carrying the blade that once severed fate from choice. They clashed not in swordplay but in will, their power shattering the very rules of existence around them. But she was no longer only flame, she was everything they had tried to destroy, every name erased, every voice silenced, every truth buried, and in one final breath, she unmade him, not with hate, but with understanding. She returned his name to him, and in doing so, took his power away. And when it was done, when the last scream faded, and the fire burned steady but no longer wild, the realm stood still, scorched but alive, and Eva, queen of nothing, flame of all, walked through the ashes of the old world into the dawn of a new one, not as ruler, but as memory made flesh, and the fire, eternal now, whispered behind her with every step, not in warning, but in welcome. Chapter 23, Ashfall and Arise. The war left its mark upon the bones of the world, not just in the ruins that stretched like broken ribs across cities once gilded in power, not only in the blackened scars seared into the ley lines that had pulsed so faithfully beneath the surface of every realm, but in the silence that followed, the strange, sacred stillness of a world that had finally exhaled, and did not yet know how to breathe again. Eva walked through the ash-strewn halls of what had once been the Crimson Court, its grandeur now a ghost, its throne shattered, its gilded columns cracked and weeping black sap where blood and magic had once mingled in ceremony, and yet within that ruin there was a pulse, not of decay but of rebirth. She could feel it rising beneath her feet like the slow stirring of seeds buried too long beneath tyranny and fear. The Great War had ended not with the coronation of a queen nor the conquest of kingdoms, but with a single name spoken in truth, a single life remembered. The name she had once buried beneath layers of survival, silence, and shame, Aurelienne, now sang through the world's forgotten corners like the last note of a symphony echoing into eternity, not a battle cry, but a call home, and they came, one by one at first, then in flocks, in waves, drawn not to power but to the promise of something new, something real, survivors from the shattered guilds of fire weavers, warlocks freed from blood-bound servitude, the mistwalkers of the pale veil, the bone-bound sisters of the morning choir, even the shrouded daughters of the vow who had spoken no names for 500 years came, their eyes wide with cautious hope as they stepped into the light of her pyres and let their silence break. Eva did not lead them with banners or edicts or proclamations. She stood among them, sleeves rolled, hands calloused from battle and ritual, her fire no longer wild and vengeful but steady, warm, and impossibly bright. She rebuilt not palaces but sanctuaries. Raised not walls but bridges between bloodlines once taught to fear each other. She listened as much as she spoke, learned more than she commanded, and through her, the world remembered how to grieve, how to rebuild, and above all, how to believe again. It was not easy. Nothing born from ruin ever was. There were nights she would wake breathless, the dreams of war still clinging to her like soot, visions of the hollow staring back with eyes full of questions she hadn't yet answered. There were days the council, now a circle of chosen voices, mortal and immortal alike, argued until the stars faded, debating how to shape a realm without thrones, how to protect without ruling, how to hold power without being consumed by it, and always, she listened. She remembered every face that fell beside her in the fire-born war, whispered their names into the wind at every dawn, and let their memory forge the foundation of what they were building, the city of Nocturne, once a heart of control and cruelty, became something new, the Emberhold, a city of flame and shadow woven together, a haven where magic of every kind could be studied, celebrated, and freed, where no bloodline dictated worth, where no silence was imposed by fear, and at the center of it all stood the Ashfall Spire, not a throne, but a tower of ever-burning flame, hollow in the heart, where the crown once melted remained encased in glass, a reminder, not of what had been lost, but what had been chosen. Every year, at the edge of the flame's memory, the Ashfall Festival would be held, lanterns carrying names of the dead into the sky, songs sung in every language known and forgotten, and Eva would walk among the people, dressed not in regalia but in simple robes, her hands open, her voice soft, her magic no longer a weapon but a seed. And beyond the Emberhold, the world slowly healed, forests regrew along the shattered vale, the skies cleared over the drowned kingdoms. The veil between realms thinned and thickened in a rhythm no longer forced but free. Even the hollow remained quiet, its great eye closed in peace for the first time in eons, and still, Eva watched, never resting, never forgetting, because though peace had come, the cost had been steep, and she knew the fire would always need tending, not to burn, but to warm, not to destroy, but to guard the truth. And one evening, as the stars spilled like silver fire across the sky and the embers of her long battle glowed quietly within her chest, she stood alone upon the spire, the wind tugging at her hair, her soul still humming with all she had lived and lost and reclaimed, and she whispered the final truth into the night, not as queen, not as martyr, not even as savior, but as one who remembered. I was never meant to rule, she said, only to remind the world how to rise. And somewhere, deep in the roots of magic, the fire listened, and answered with light. Chapter 24, The Flame That Remains. Dawn bled slowly across the horizon, not in gold but in ember red and soft violet, like the sky itself had learned to echo the quiet fire that now lived in the heart of the world. The light touched the spires of the Emberhold first, glinting off the newly grown glass vines that curled around the towers, forged not from flame or spell, but from the collective will of the magic-born who had risen from ash and silence to shape a future none had dared dream before. Below, the city stirred. Cobblestone streets that once echoed with marching boots now resonated with music and morning rituals, the ringing of chimes carved from crystal bone, the scent of bread laced with stormroot, the laughter of children whose blood would never be bound by fear. And at the edge of the city, beyond the great arch of reclaimed ironwood that marked the threshold of the Emberhold, Eva walked alone through the wild fields blooming where battlegrounds had once burned. Her fingers trailed through soft stalks of ghost grass and flame petal, plants born from spell fire and memory, thriving now under skies no longer scarred by ward light. She was dressed in black, but not in mourning, in reverence, the color of coal before it becomes flame, her hair unbound, her bare feet silent upon the earth, and with every step, the land remembered her, vines shifting slightly to guide her path, petals leaning toward her shadow, the wind curling around her like a lover-long mist. She carried no staff, no blade, no relic of rule, only a small satchel of seeds, gifts from the root witches of the verdant hollow, offerings from those who had once cursed her name and now trusted her with their future. She paused at the remains of an old stone outpost, one of many that had once kept the realms divided, patrolled by enforcers of the covenant who no longer drew breath or blade. Now it stood half swallowed by moss and time. Its tower cracked open to the sky, and she climbed it. Slowly, reverently. Until she reached the top, where the wind spoke louder and the world stretched wide in every direction. Far to the north, the snowcaps of the howling ranges glistened, their exile camps now empty, reclaimed by their people. To the east, the silver marshes shimmered with healing lay pools, no longer corrupted. To the west, the great sea glittered beneath the rising sun, and somewhere beneath its surface, the leviathans had begun to sing again. Eva stood in silence and let it all wash over her. The vastness of what had changed, the weight of what had been survived, the unbearable beauty of what still remained, and then she reached into the satchel and took a single seed, no larger than a tear, no heavier than a promise, and she knelt, placing it into the cracked stone where blood had once been spilled by decree. She pressed her palm to it, whispered no spell, only a name, hope, and the seed sparked, pulsed, and took root instantly, glowing faintly as tiny green threads stretched downward. Merging with the memory of the land, she smiled, and it was not the smile of victory or relief, but of deep, aching knowing, for even now, in peace, she understood the cycle would try to return, that power would seek new ways to disguise itself as order, that fear would one day wear a crown again, but now there would always be fire, not to consume but to remind, not to rage but to light the path, and she would be here, not forever, not always, but long enough to teach others to tend it, to carry it, to wield it not as a weapon but as a beacon. She stood, wind tugging at the hem of her robe, and looked up as the morning sun crowned her in light, and somewhere deep within her, the hollow whispered, not in warning, but in gratitude, a reminder that even wounds, when honored, can become sources of strength. And as she descended the tower, the first green leaves of the flammavine coiled upward through the stone behind her, blooming where once only ruin had grown, and the world exhaled, slowly, softly, knowing that no matter what came next, there would always be someone who remembered the fire, someone who would light it again. Epilogue, the song beneath the embers. Years passed, and the story of the Flame Queen became legend, not the kind whispered in fear, nor the kind twisted into propaganda, but the rare kind woven with care into the tapestry of every hearth, every school of magic, every midnight tale told beneath stars that now shone just a little brighter. Eva's name was no longer buried or broken, it was spoken freely, sung in lullabies, etched into the arches of bridges rebuilt with stone and spellcraft, painted in the stained glass windows of the Emberhold's great hall, not with reverence for royalty, but with reverence for resistance, for the light that had refused to die. The Emberhold itself stood as a living testament to what the world could become when truth was no longer shackled by bloodline or fear, a city without thrones, governed by a council of many, chosen not by lineage or title but by merit, by voice, by the fire within, and the world beyond it changed too, not without pain, not without effort. But the change endured, the forgotten realms once cloaked in shadow now pulsed with life, their people returning, rebuilding, remembering who they had once been before the covenant carved their history in silence. The crimson choir sang again, not as weapons, but as healers, their songs now laced with magic that soothed rather than shattered, and even the hollow, once a scar of cosmic dread, had become a place of pilgrimage, a sacred wound that hummed with tempered power and gave guidance to those willing to listen. They came from all over, from frost-marked isles and desert citadels, from the deep woods where fey blood still shimmered in the roots, from seafaring clans who now navigated lay currents as easily as tides, and always they asked the same question: where is she now? But Eva did not remain in the city she helped rebuild. She was never meant to rule, never meant to be still. She moved like fire itself, appearing in scattered villages to lend aid, walking with wanderers who had forgotten their purpose, speaking at rites of passing where the old and powerful were finally allowed to sleep. No guards, no banners, just the quiet presence of the woman who had once unmade a world and forged another from its ashes. Time wore on, and though the world evolved, the fire she left behind never dimmed. It lived on in the teachings of the Ember Circle, a gathering of magic bearers and lore keepers sworn not to hoard knowledge but to spread it like seeds, in the wind keepers of the howling ranges, whose wings bore messages of peace faster than war could travel, in the Glimmerbound, a traveling collective of performers, poets, and truth-tellers who reminded the world of the cost of silence through stories that always ended in flame and dawn. And still, no matter how much time passed, the Ashfall spire burned, a steady, unwavering pillar of fire in the heart of the realm, not devouring, not fading, but illuminating, and within it, encased in a spiral of glass and golden sigils, the crown remained, no longer a tool of dominion, but a symbol, untouched, unclaimed, because none needed it now to lead, for they had learned the truth Eva had always carried, that real power was not in thrones or titles, but in the courage to choose differently, to listen deeply, to burn when necessary and bloom when possible. They said she would return when the world needed her most, when the stars trembled and the hollow stirred again, and so a room was always left unclaimed in every sanctuary, every hall, every village built from her fire, not in fear of what would come, but in faith that she would. And though the world never again saw her crowned, it saw her reflected in the flame, in the freedom, in the unbreakable legacy of a girl who had once sung in a smoky tavern, worn another name, and dared to remember who she was: Aurelienne, the queen who burned the silence, the one who lit the way not to conquest, but to becoming. And the fire, now eternal, kept whispering her name beneath the embers, just in case she was listening.
Every story has an ending, but some mysteries live on. If you enjoyed this tale, don't let it fade into the shadows. Smash that like button and subscribe for more thrilling stories that will transport you beyond the veil of the ordinary. Subscribe to our channel and your name will appear at the beginning of our next video, where we will personally thank you for your subscribing. Tap the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the unknown. Share your thoughts in the comments. What twists did you see coming? And what secrets do you think still remain? Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and let the next story begin.